Soon we had reached a Pingstar village administrative unit called a Julberg, whose tower would have struck 12, if the Icelandic churches had been rich enough to possess a clock, but they closely resemble their parishioners, who have no watches but manage quite well without. The horses were watered there, and afterwards took us along a shore squeezed in between the sea and a chain of hills, then carried us without stopping to the Awalkirkja of Brantar, and then a mile further to Sorbo or 56 Annexia, Church Annex, situated on the southern shores of the Hvalfjord. It was now 4 o'clock, and we had covered 4 miles. 57. The fjord was at least half a mile wide at this point. The waves crashed noisily onto the sharp rocks. This bay opened out between high rocky walls, a sort of vertical scarp 3,000 feet high, with remarkable brown strata separated by tough beds of a reddish tinge. However intelligent our horses were, I was not looking forward to crossing a real sea estuary on the back of a four-legged animal. If they really are smart, I said, they won't try and cross. In any case, I'm planning to be smart on their behalf. But my uncle didn't want to wait. He spurred his horse on towards the shore. His mount sniffed slightly at the swell lapping at the edge and stopped. My uncle, who had his own instinct, urged it on all the more. And 55 tough, produced by the consolidation of volcanic ash. 56 Sorboer, modern Sor BFR. 57 20 miles. JV, other refusal from the beast, who shook his head. Next, oaths and an application of the whip, but kicks from the creature, who began to unsaddle the rider. Finally the small horse, bending his knees, withdrew from the professor's legs and left him standing there on 2 seashore rocks, like the Colossus of Rhodes. "Cursed animal!" shouted the rider, suddenly converted into a pedestrian, as humiliated as a cavalry officer turned infantryman. "Farja," said the guide, touching him on the shoulder. "What, a ferry?" replied Hans, pointing to a boat. "Yes," I called out, "there's a ferry. You should have said so earlier." "Well, come on. Tidvatten." "What's he saying?" "He's saying, tide," translated my uncle from the Danish. "We presumably have to wait for the tide." "Forbida. Ja. 58." My uncle stamped his foot, while the horses headed for the ferry. I perfectly understood the need to wait for a particular moment of the tide before starting to cross the fjord, the moment when the sea has reached its highest level and so is not moving. The ebb and flow are not felt then, and the ferry is not in danger of being carried to the bottom of the bay or out to the open sea. The right time only arrived at 6 o'clock. My uncle, myself, the guide, 2 ferrymen, and the 4 horses had got onto a sort of flatboat which looked rather fragile. Accustomed as I was to the steam ferries on the Elbe, I found the boatman's oars an unimpressive mechanical device. It took more than an hour to cross the fjord, but finally we arrived without incident. Half an hour later, we had reached the Awalkirkja of Gerar. 13. It should have been dark, but on the 65th parallel I was not surprised to see light during the night in the Arctic regions. In June and July in Iceland the sun never sets. Nevertheless, the temperature had gone down. I was cold and above all hungry. Most welcome was the boar which hospitably opened to receive us. It was a peasant's house but worth a king's in terms of hospitality. When we arrived, the master came to shake our hands and, without further ado, indicated we should follow him into the house. Follow him, for it would have been impossible to go in at the same time. A long, narrow, dark passage led into this dwelling constructed of beams that had hardly been squared off. It gave access to each of the 58 farja, Danish, farvel, Swedish, farja, Danish and Swedish, dar, tidvatten, and forbida, wait, Swedish, ja, Danish and Swedish rooms, the kitchen, the weaving workshop, the badstofa, family bedroom, and, the best of all, the visitor's bedroom. My uncle, whose height had not been remotely considered when the house was built, duly hit his head 3 or 4 times against the projections of the ceiling. We were shown into our room, which was quite large and had an earthen floor and a window with panes made of rather opaque sheep membranes. The bed was dry straw heaped into 2 wooden frames painted red and ornamented with maxims in Icelandic. I was not expecting such comfort, but the house was pervaded with a strong smell of dried fish, marinated meat, and sour milk which rather upset my nose. After setting down our traveler's saddlery, we heard our host's voice inviting us into the kitchen, the only room with a fire even during the very coldest weather. My uncle hastened to follow this hospitable suggestion. I followed suit. The kitchen chimney was of the classical sort, just a primitive stone as a hearth in the middle of the room, with a hole in the roof to let the smoke out. The kitchen also served as the dining room. When we came in, our host, as if seeing us for the first time, greeted us with the word "sarlvertu," which means "be happy," and came and kissed us on the cheek. His wife pronounced the same word in turn, accompanied by the same greeting, then the 2 of them, putting their right hands on their hearts, bowed deeply. I hasten to add that the Icelandic woman was the mother of 19 children, some small and some big and all chaotically teeming in the SPI rals of smoke filling the room from the hearth. At each moment I caught sight of another little blonde head of some melancholy emerging from the cloud. It was exactly like a line of angels who had forgotten to wash their faces. My uncle and I gave a very warm welcome to the brood. Soon we had 3 or 4 of the urchins on our shoulders, the same number on our laps, and the others between our knees. Those who could speak repeated, "Salvertu," in all imaginable pitches. Those who could not merely shouted louder. The concert was interrupted by the meal being announced. At this moment the hunter came back, having seen to the horses' food by thriftily letting them out on the countryside. The poor beasts had to be satisfied with chewing the rare mosses on the rocks and some seaweed without much sustenance. The following day they would be sure to come of their own accord to continue the work of the day before. "Salvertu," said Hans. Then, calmly, automatically, without one kiss being different from another, he greeted the host, the hostess, and their 19 children. Once the ceremony was over, we moved to table, all 24 of us, and consequently some literally on top of the others. The luckiest ones had only 2 urchins on their knees. However, silence fell across the whole community when the soup arrived, and the natural Icelandic taciturnity, even amongst the youngsters, came back. Our host served us a lichen soup which was not unpleasant, then an enormous portion of dried fish swimming in butter that had been soured for 20 years, and was consequently much to be preferred to fresh butter according to the gastronomic ideas of Iceland. With it was skyr, a sort of curdled milk, served with biscuits and sweetened with the juice of juniper berries, and finally, as a drink, whey mixed with water, called blanda in this country. If this remarkable food was good or not, I was unable to judge. I was hungry and, when the dessert came, swallowed every last mouthful of the thick buckwheat porridge. After the meal was finished, the children disappeared, the adults grouped round the hearth which was burning with peat, heather, cowpats, and the bones from the dried fish. Then, after this taking of the heat, the various groups went to their respective rooms. The hostess, as was the custom, offered to take off our stockings and trousers but, following our gracious declining of this offer, did not insist, and I was finally able to curl up in my straw bedding. The following day, at 5 o'clock, we bade the Icelandic farmer farewell, although my uncle had great difficulty in making him accept sufficient payment, and finally Hans gave the signal for departure. Less than 100 yards from Gerar, the appearance of the landscape began to change, the ground became marshy and the going less easy. On the right the chain of mountains extended indefinitely, in a huge system of natural fortifications, of which we were following the counterscarp. Often there were streams which had to be forded, without getting the bags too wet. The wasteland was getting more and more deserted. Sometimes, nevertheless, a human shadow in the distance seemed to be shunning contact. If the bends of the path unexpectedly brought us near one of these ghosts, I felt a sudden disgust at the sight of a swollen head with shiny skin devoid of hair and repulsive wounds showing through the rents in the miserable rags. The unhappy creature did not come to hold out his deformed hand, he ran away instead, but not before Hans had had time to greet him with the customary "Salvertu." "Spatelsh," he said. 59, a leper. This single word produced a frightful effect. The horrible affliction of leprosy is relatively common in Iceland. It is not contagious, but is hereditary. Accordingly, the wretched creatures are forbidden to marry. These wraith-like figures were hardly calculated to add joy to the countryside, which was becoming deeply depressing, as the last patches of grass died under our feet. Not a single tree, if one excludes a few thickets of dwarf birches similar to brushwood. Not a single animal, x59, Spatelsh, Danish, Spetels, Swedish, Spetels, except a few horses that their owner could not feed and which wandered over the sad plains. Sometimes a falcon glided amongst the grey clouds and fled in full flight towards some southern clime. I let myself become absorbed in the melancholy of this untamed nature, and my memories took me back to my native land. Soon we had to cross several insignificant little fjords, and finally a real bay. The tide, steady at this time, allowed us to traverse without waiting and thus reach the hamlet of Aftanes, a mile further on the other side. In the evening, after fording across 2 rivers teeming with trout and pike, the Afta and Hedda, we were obliged to spend the night in a tumble-down abandoned cottage, worthy of being haunted by all the goblins of Scandinavian mythology. The god of cold had clearly taken up residence there, and he was up to his tricks the whole night. The following day presented no particular incident. Still the same marshy ground, the same uniform view, the same sad features. In the evening we had covered half the total distance, and slept in the annexia at Krosolpt. On the 19th of June, a bed of lava extended beneath our feet for about a mile. This kind of ground is called ron locally. The lava, wrinkled on the surface, produced shapes like thick ropes, either simply stretched out or coiled up on themselves. A huge lava flow came down from the neighboring mountains, now extinct volcanoes but whose remnants testified to the violence of the past. A few wreaths of steam from hot springs still crept here and there. We had little time to marvel at these phenomena, we had to push on. Soon the marshy ground came back under our horses' feet, crisscrossed by little lakes. We were now proceeding in a westerly direction. We had worked our way round the great Faxa Bay, and the two white peaks of Snaefels stood erect amongst the clouds less than 5 miles away. The horses were moving well, the problems of the terrain did not stop them. For my part, one was beginning to feel very tired. My uncle remained as stiff and as upright as on the first day. I could not help admiring him as much as the hunter, who considered this expedition a simple stroll. On Saturday the 20th of June, at 6 p.m., we got to Boudir, a village on the sea coast, and the guide asked for his agreed pay. My uncle settled the sum. It was Hans's own family, his uncles and first cousins, who offered their hospitality. We were kindly welcomed, and without wishing to abuse the generosity of these good people, I would have been very glad to recover from the fatigues of the journey in their house. But my uncle, who had nothing to recover from, didn't see it that way, and the following day we had to straddle our good old mounts once more. The ground was affected by being near the mountain, with granite roots emerging from the earth like those of an old oak. We were working our way round the huge base of the volcano. The professor couldn't take his eyes off it. He waved his arms, he seemed to be sending challenges to it, as if saying, "That's the giant I am going to slay." Finally, after 4 hours' ride, the horses stopped of their own accord at the front door of Stepi Parsonage. 14 Stepi is a settlement of about 30 shacks, built on the lava itself and in the rays of the sun reflected from the volcano. It lies at the end of a Lidtle fjord which forms part of a basalt wall of a most curious appearance. It needs no repeating that basalt is a dark brown rock of igneous origin. It takes on regular forms which produce surprising patterns. Nature proceeds geometrically here, working in the human fashion, as if she had used a set square, a pair of compasses, and a plumb line. If in every other case her art consists of great heaps strewn in disorder, barely formed cones, imperfect pyramids, strange collections of lines, here, wanting to provide an example of regularity, and working before the architects of the first ages, she has constructed a severe order which has never been surpassed. Even in the marvels of Babylon are the wonders that were Greece. I had of course heard of the Giant's Causeway in Ireland and Fingal's Cave on one of the Hebrides, but I had never actually seen the display of a basalt construction. Here at Stepi, I was able to appreciate the full beauty of the phenomenon. The walls of the fjord, like the whole coast of the peninsula, were made up of a series of vertical columns 30 feet tall. These straight shafts of perfect proportions supported an archivolt made of horizontal columns, whose overhang produced a half-vault over the sea. At intervals in this natural impluvium, one's eye detected arched openings of a superb design, through which rushed and foamed the waves from the open sea. A few basalt sections, torn off by the ocean's furies, were stretched out on the ground like the remains of a classical temple, ruins eternally young, over which the centuries would pass without leaving any mark. This was the last overnight stop of our overland journey. Hans had brought us here with intelligence, and I drew some reassurance from the thought that he was to accompany us further. When we arrived at the door of the rector's house, a simple low-built croft that was no finer and no more comfortable than its neighbors, I found a man shoeing a horse, hammer in hand and dressed in a leather apron. "Salvertu," the hunter said. "God dag," replied the shoeing smith in perfect Danish. "Kirkoward," said Hans, turning to my uncle. "The rector. It seems, Axel, that this good man is the rector." In the meantime the guide had been explaining the situation to the Kirkoward. Interrupting his work, this man shouted out in a way presumably designed for horses and horse dealers, and immediately a big, ugly woman came out of the croft. If she was not 6 feet tall, the difference wasn't worth mentioning. I was afraid that she might offer the travelers an Icelandic kiss, but this didn't happen, and nor did she demonstrate very good grace in showing us into her house. The guest room seemed to me the worst in the parsonage, narrow, dirty, and foul-smelling. But we had no choice. The rector apparently didn't practice the traditional hospitality. Far from it. Before the day was out, I could see that we were dealing with a blacksmith, a fisherman, a hunter, a carpenter, and not at all with a minister of the Lord. We were in midweek, it has to be admitted. Perhaps he made up for it on Sundays. I do not wish to criticize these poor priests who are, after all, perfectly wretched. They get a ludicrous income from the Danish government and receive a quarter of a tithe from their parish, which does not even add up to 60 marks at present-day values. 60, hence the need to work for a living. But by fishing, hunting, and shoeing horses, one ends up adopting the manners, tone, and habits of hunters, fishermen, and other slightly rustic people. That same evening I noticed that amongst our hosts Veer Tuesday, sobriety did not figure. My uncle quickly understood what sort of man he was dealing with. Instead of a fine, dignified scholar, he found a heavy, rude countryman. He accordingly resolved to begin his great expedition as soon as possible and to leave this inhospitable rectory. Ignoring his tiredness, he decided we would spend a few days in the mountains. Preparations for leaving were accordingly made the day after arriving at Stepi. Hans hired the services of 3 Icelanders to replace the horses carrying the luggage. Once we got to the bottom of the crater, these locals would have to turn back, leaving us on our own. That point was made clear. At this juncture, my uncle had to tell the hunter of his intention to continue his exploration of the volcano to its furthermost limits. Hans merely inclined his head. Whether he went there or somewhere else, whether he plunged into the innards of his island or traveled over its surface, made no difference to him. I myself had rather forgotten about the future, distracted until this point by the events of the journey, but now felt my emotions taking hold of me more than ever. What could I do? If I had wanted to try and stand up to Professor Leidenbrock, it should have been in Hamburg and not at the foot of Snæfell's. One idea above all others worried me tremendously, a terrifying idea that might unsettle nerves stronger than mine. So, I said to myself, we're going to climb Snæfell's. Fine. We're going to have a look at its crater. Good. Others have done it and lived to tell the tale. But that is not all. If a path appears going down into the bowels of the earth, if that wretched Saknussemm was telling the truth, we're going to get lost in the underground galleries of the volcano. But there's nothing to say that Snæfell's really is extinct. What proves that an eruption is not in preparation? Because the monster has been asleep since 60 Hamburg unit, about 90 francs. JV 1229, 61. Does it necessarily follow that it won't wake up again? And if it does wake up, what will happen to us? It was certainly worth thinking about, which I was doing most seriously. I couldn't sleep without dreaming of eruptions. And playing the part of Scoria seemed to me rather difficult. In the end I couldn't stand it anymore. I decided to put the case to my uncle as skillfully as possible, presenting it as a hypothesis which couldn't possibly be put into practice. I went and found him. I shared my fears with him, and then retreated so that he could explode unhindered. I've been thinking about it, was his only reply. What did these words mean? Was he going to listen to the voice of reason? Was he thinking of giving up his projects? It seemed much too good to be true. After a few moments of silence, during which I did not dare to question him, he continued, I had thought of it. Since we arrived in Stepi, I have anxiously considered the critical question you have just put to me, for we must not be hasty. No, we mustn't, I said emphatically. Although Snæfell's has been silent for 600 years, it might speak again. But eruptions are always preceded by perfectly well-known phenomena. I have therefore questioned the local inhabitants, I have surveyed the ground, and I can assure you, Axel, that there will not be an eruption. I stood flabbergasted at this statement, and was not able to reply. Do you not believe me? Said my uncle. Well then, follow me. I obeyed without thinking. Leaving the rectory, the professor took a direct route which led through a gap in the basalt rock face, heading inland. Soon we were out in open country, if that term can be used for a huge waste ground of discarded volcanic material. The country appeared flattened under a hail of huge boulders, of trapped basalt, granite, and all the pyroxenic rocks. 62 Here and there I could see exhalations rising in the air. These white mists, called raker in Icelandic, came from hot springs, and their intensity showed the volcanic activity of the ground. This seemed to me to justify my fears. So I fell off my stool when my uncle said, Do you see all that steam, Axel? Well, it proves that we have nothing to fear from the fury of the volcano. I don't believe it. Listen carefully. When an eruption is on the way, the steam increases considerably, but then disappears completely when the phenomenon is actually happening, for the expanding gas no longer has the required pressure, and heads for the craters instead of escaping through the 61-1229, cf 1219, in ch. 62 pyroxenic rocks, any of a large group of dark-colored minerals containing silicates of magnesium, iron, and calcium, cracks of the globe. If therefore this steam stays in its normal state, if its force does not increase, if you add to such an observation that the wind and rain are not replaced by a heavy, calm atmosphere, you can safely say that there will not be an immediate eruption. But, enough. When science has spoken, one can only remain silent thereafter. I returned to the parsonage a little hangdog. My uncle had defeated me by means of scientific arguments. I had one remaining hope, however, that once we got to the bottom of the crater, it would be impossible, for lack of a gallery, to go any deeper, in spite of all the Saknussemms in the world. I spent the night in the clutches of a nightmare. I was in the middle of a volcano in the depths of the earth. I felt as if I was being thrown into interplanetary space in the form of eruptive rock. The following day, the 23rd of June, Hans was waiting for us with his companions, who were loaded down with food, tools, and instruments. 2 of the iron-tipped sticks, 2 rifles, and 2 cartridge belts were set aside for my uncle and myself. Hans, a man of foresight, had added to our bags a full goatskin water bottle which, together with our flasks, meant that we had water for a week. It was 9 a.m. The rector and his huge bad-tempered wife were waiting in front of the door. They presumably wished to give us the last farewell that a host addresses to the traveler. But this farewell took the unexpected shape of a formidable bill, which charged even for the air of the pastoral house, far from fresh air I may say. The worthy couple held us to ransom like a Swiss innkeeper and put a high price on their overrated hospitality. My uncle paid without quibbling. A man who was leaving for the center of the earth sniffed at a few rix dollars. Once the matter was settled, Hans gave the signal for departure, and a few moments later we had left Stepi. 15 Snaefels is 5,000 feet high. Its double cone marks the end of a trachytic strip which is separate from the main relief system of the island. From our point of departure we couldn't see its 2 peaks in profile against the grayish background of the sky. I could only see an enormous snowy cap lowered on the giant's forehead. We were walking in single file, following the hunter. He was climbing up narrow paths where 2 men couldn't have proceeded abreast. All conversation therefore became more or less impossible. Beyond the basalt wall of Stepi Fjord we encountered first a peaty soil, fibrous and herbaceous, the remains of the age-old vegetation of the marshes on the peninsula. These quantities of fuel, which have never been put to use, would be sufficient to heat the whole population of Iceland for a century. The huge peat bog, to judge from the bottom of the raw vines in it, was often 70 feet deep and consisted of successive layers of carbonized refuse, separated by thin sheets of pumiceous tuff. As a true nephew of Professor Leidenbrock, and despite my worries, I examined with interest the mineralogical curiosities displayed in this vast natural history collection. At the same time my mind ran through the whole geological history of Iceland. This extraordinary island clearly emerged from the watery depths at a relatively recent period. It is perhaps still rising imperceptibly. If indeed so, its origin can only be attributed to the work of underground fires. Accordingly, in such a case, Sir Humphrey Davy's theory, Saknussemm's document, my uncle's claims, all went up in smoke. This hypothesis led me to examine the nature of the ground closely, and I was soon able to observe the successive phenomena governing its formation. Iceland, which has no sedimentary terrain at all, is composed uniquely of volcanic tuff, that is of an agglomeration of stones and rocks of a po-rouse texture. Before the volcanoes appeared, it consisted of a trappean massif, slowly lifted above the waves by the pressure of the forces in the center. The central fires had not yet burst out. But later a wide slit cut its way diagonally from the southwest to the northeast of the island, and the whole trachytic magma gradually poured out. At that time the phenomenon happened without violence, for the exit was very large, and the molten matter thrown up by the vitals of the globe, spread quietly out in vast sheets or mammary bulges. The feldspars, cyanites, and porphyries appeared during this period. But thanks to this effusion, the thickness of the island increased considerably, and consequently its resistance. One can imagine what quantities of gas under pressure were built up in its breast when there was no longer any way out after the cooling of the trachytic crust. There came therefore a moment when the mechanical force of these gases was such as to lift up the heavy crust and to create high chimneys. Hence this volcano's raising of the outermost crust, and then the sudden piercing of a crater at the top of the volcano. After the eruptive phenomena came the volcanic ones. Through the recently made openings escaped first the basaltic dejecta, of which the plain we were crossing at this moment offered us the most splendid specimens. We were walking over these heavy dark gray rocks that the cooling down had molded into prisms with hexagonal bases. In the distance could be seen a large number of flattened cones, each of which was for merely a fire-breathing mouth. Then, when the basaltic eruption was exhausted, the volcano, which drew its strength from that of the extinct craters, gave passage to the lavasse and to those tuffs made up of cinders and scoria whose long spread-out rivulets I could see on its shoulders, like an opulent head of hair. Such were the successive phenomena that had constructed Iceland. All of them came from the effect of the internal fires, and to suppose that the interior did not remain in a permanent state of white-hot flux was pure madness. It was madness, especially, to claim to be able to reach the center of the globe. So I was reassuring myself about the results of our undertaking as we moved in to attack Snaefels. The route was becoming more and more difficult, the ground was climbing, the loose rocks were easily displaced and it needed the most careful concentration to avoid dangerous falls. Hans carried calmly on, as if moving over unbroken ground. Sometimes he passed behind huge boulders and we lost sight of him for a moment, but then a piercing whistle would spring from his lips to tell us which way to go. Often he would stop, pick up loose pieces of rock and arrange them into beacons in a recognizable fashion, so as to mark the way back. An admirable precaution in itself, but one that would be made useless by future events. 3 hours' tiring march had only brought us as far as the base of the mountain. At this point Hans called a halt, and we shared a quick lunch. My uncle took double mouthfuls to save time. But since this halt was also a rest period, he was forced to wait until the guide was completely ready. He gave the signal for departure an hour later. The 3 Icelanders, as taciturn as their hunter companion, didn't utter a single word and ate soberly. We now began to move up the slopes of Snæfell's. By an optical illusion common with mountains, its snow-covered summit seemed to me very close, and yet, how many long hours it took to reach it. Above all, what fatigue! The stones, not held together by earth or grass, rolled from under our feet and disappeared towards the plain at the speed of an avalanche. At certain places, the sides of the mountain made an angle of at least 36 degrees with the horizon. It was impossible to climb them, and we had to work our way round these steep rock-strewn slopes with considerable difficulty. In such cases we helped each other by means of sticks. I have to say that my uncle kept close to me as often as possible. He never lost sight of me, and on quite a few occasions his arm provided solid support. He himself undoubtedly had an innate sense of balance, for he never hesitated. The Icelanders climbed with the sure-footedness of Highlanders, despite their heavy loads. To judge from the height of the peak of Snæfell's, I assumed it was impossible for us to reach it from this side, unless the angle of the slope decreased. Fortunately, after an hour of tiring efforts and considerable feats, a sort of staircase suddenly appeared in the middle of a vast carpet of snow built up on top of the volcano, and this helped our climb. It was formed by one of those rivers of stones called Stina in Icelandic, thrown out by the eruptions. If this river hadn't been stopped dead by the shape of the mountain's flanks, it would have thrown itself into the sea, and thus formed new islands. As it was, it helped a great deal. The steepness of the slope increased, but the stone steps meant that it could be climbed without problem. So quick was our progress that, remaining behind for a moment while my companions carried on up, I saw that they were already reduced to microscopic size by the distance. By 7 in the evening we had climbed the 2,000 steps of the staircase. We stood at the top of a big swelling of the mountain, a sort of base on which rested the cone forming the crater. The sea stretched out at a depth of 3,200 feet. We were above the line of perpetual snows, at a relatively low level in Iceland because of the constant humidity of the climate. It was bitterly cold. The wind blew hard. I felt utterly exhausted. The professor saw clearly that my legs were refusing to carry me and decided to stop despite his impatience. He therefore made a sign to the hunter, who shook his head saying, "Evanfer. Apparently we need to go higher." He asked Hans the reason for his reply. "Mistor." "Ja, Mistor," repeated one of the Icelanders in a frightened tone. "What does the word mean?" I asked anxiously. "Look there," replied my uncle. I turned to look at the plain. An immense column of ground-up pumice ice, stone, sand, and dust was climbing, swirling like a waterspout. The wind was driving it against the flank of Snæfell's, which we were now clinging to. This opaque curtain, spread out before the sun, threw a large shadow over the whole mountain. If the waterspout leaned over, it would inevitably embrace us in its swirls. Such a phenomenon, called mistor in Icelandic, is quite common when the wind blows in from the glaciers. "Hastigd, hastigd, 63," shouted the guide. Without knowing Danish, I understood that we had to follow Hans as quickly as possible. He began to work his way round the cone of the crater, at an angle to make the going easier. Soon the waterspout crashed down on the mountain, which quivered at the shock. The stones caught up in the eddies rained down as if in an eruption. Fortunately we were on the other side and sheltered from all danger. If it hadn't been for the guide's precaution, our torn bodies would have been pulverized and dropped far away like the product of some unknown meteor. However, Hans didn't consider it prudent to spend the night on the side of the cone. We continued our zigzagging ascent. The 1,500 feet still to be covered took nearly 5 hours, for the detours, paths at an angle, and retreats measured at least 8 miles. I couldn't go on. I was overcome by cold and hunger. The air was slightly rarefied and insufficient to fill my lungs. Finally, at 11 at night, very much in darkness, we reached the summit of Snæfell's. Before going to shelter inside the crater, I caught 63, hastigd, Danish, hastig, Swedish, hastigd, sight of the midnight sun at the lowest point in its life's course, sending its pale rays over the island sleeping at my feet. 16 supper was quickly swallowed and the mini-expedition settled down as well as it could. The ground was very hard, the shelter fragile, the situation very uncomfortable at 5,000 feet above sea level. But my sleep was especially calm that night, one of the best I'd spent for a long time. I didn't even dream. In the morning we woke up half frozen by a glacial temperature but in the rays of a fine sun. I got up from my granite bed to go and enjoy the magnificent spectacle laid out before my eyes. I was standing on the southern summit of Snæfells's twin peaks. The panorama extended over most of the island. As at all great heights, the perspective lifted up the shores while the central parts seemed to have sunk. You would have thought that one of Helbsmer's relief maps was spread beneath my feet. I saw deep valleys criss-crossing in every direction, chasms opening up like shafts, lakes turned into ponds, rivers become brooks. On my right were endless glaciers and repeated peaks, some of them plumed with light smoke. The undulations of these infinite mountains, whose layers of snow made them appear foaming, reminded me of the surface of a rough sea. If I turned towards the west, the ocean spread out its magnificent expanse like a continuation of the white horses of the summits. I could hardly see where the land stopped and the swell began. I plunged into that high-blown ecstasy produced by lofty peaks, without feeling dizzy this time, as I was finally getting used to these sublime contemplations. My dazzled eyes bathed in the clear irradiation of the sun's rays. I forgot who I was, where I was, and lived the life of elves and sylphs, those imaginary inhabitants of Scandinavian mythology. I was intoxicated by the voluptuous pleasure of the heights, oblivious of the depths my fate was shortly going to plunge me into. But I was brought back to reality by the arrival of the professor and Hans, joining me at the very summit. Turning to the west, my uncle pointed towards a slight mist, a haze, a hint of land above the line of the waves. Greenland. Greenland. Yes, we're less than 90 miles away, 64, and during the thaws the polar bears come as far as Iceland, carried down from the north on ice floes. But that is of little importance. We are at the summit of Snæfell's, with its twin peaks, one to the north and the other to the south. Hans will tell us what the Icelanders call the one bearing us at this instant. The hunter duly replied to his question. Skartaris, 64, 90 miles away. The shortest distance from Iceland to Greenland is in fact about 180 miles. My uncle looked at me in triumph. To the crater. The crater of Snæfell's formed an inverted cone whose mouth was probably slightly more than a mile across. It seemed to me to be about 2,000 feet deep. One should imagine the state of such a receptacle when it was filling up with thunder and flames. The bottom of the funnel was only about 500 feet in circumference, so its relatively gentle slopes allowed one to reach the lower part with ease. I couldn't help comparing this crater to an enormous widened-out blunderbuss, and the comparison terrified me. To climb down into a blunderbuss, I thought, when it may be loaded and could go off at the least shock, you've got to be crazy. But there was no going back. With an indifferent expression, Hans took the lead. I followed him without a word. In order to make the going easier, Hans described greatly lengthened ellipses on the inside of the cone. We had to pass amongst stones from eruptions, some of which, when loosened from their crevices, would rebound and rush down to the bottom of the chasm. Their fall produced waves of strange-sounding echoes. Parts of the cone were covered with internal glaciers. Hans moved forward here with tremendous caution, prodding the ground with his iron-tipped stick, looking for crevasses. At some of the difficult parts, we had to tie ourselves together with a long rope, so that if by chance one of us happened to slip, he would be held up by his companions. This solidarity constituted a useful precaution, but did not remove all danger. Despite the difficulties of climbing down slopes unknown to the guide, we covered the distance without incident, except for the fall of a packet of ropes which slipped from the hands of one of the Icelanders, and took the shortest route towards the bottom of the chasm. We arrived at midday. I looked up and saw the high mouth of the cone framing part of the sky, an almost perfect circle, but with a dramatically reduced circumference. Only at one point did the peak of Skartaris stand out and plunge into the huge space. At the bottom of the crater opened 3 vents through which, at the time when Snæfell's used to erupt, the central fire forced its lava and its steam. Each of these chimneys was about 100 feet across. There they were, wide open, beneath our feet. I didn't dare look down into them. As for Professor Leidenbrock, he had quickly examined their shape and size. He was breathing heavily, running from one to the other, waving his arms and shouting unintelligible words. Hans and his companions sat on hummocks of lava and watched. They clearly took him for a madman. Suddenly my uncle cried out. At first I thought he had lost his footing and fallen into one of the 3 holes. But then I saw him, standing with arms outstretched and legs apart in front of a granite boulder placed at the center of the crater, like an enormous pedestal designed for a statue of Pluto. 65 He stood like a man dumbstruck, but it soon turned instead into an insane happiness. Axel, Axel, come here, down here. I ran down. Hans and the Icelanders stayed exactly where they were. Look, said the professor. Dumbstruck like him, but markedly less happy, I read on the western side of the boulder, in runic characters gnawed by time, the 1,000 times accursed name, Arn Saknussemm. shouted my uncle. Can you have any doubt now? I didn't reply, but came back to my lava seat in a state of total confusion. I was crushed by the evidence. How long I spent sunk in my thoughts I don't know. All I'm certain of is that when I looked up again I found my uncle and Hans alone at the bottom of the crater. The Icelanders had been dismissed, and were now climbing down the outer slopes of Snæfellsnes on their way back to Stepi. Hans was quietly sleeping at the foot of a rock, in a lava channel where he had improvised a bed. My uncle was walking up and down the floor of the crater, like some wild animal in a trap dug by a hunter. I had neither the strength nor the desire to get up, and, imitating the guide, slipped into a harrowing doze, thinking I could hear noises or feel shivers in the sides of the mountain. That was how our first night at the bottom of the crater was spent. The following day, a gray sky, cloudy and heavy, lowered over the summit of the cone. I noticed this less from the darkness of the chasm than from the anger that took hold of my uncle. I understood why, and a last feeling of hope came back to me. The reason was as follows: of the 3 routes open under our feet, only one had been followed by Saknussemm. According to the Icelandic scholar, it was to be identified by the particularity described in the cryptogram, namely that the shadow of Skartaris came and played along its edge during the last few days of the month of June. This sharp peak could thus be considered the style of a huge sundial, whose silhouette on a given day marked the way to the center of our globe. If by chance the sun was not there, no shadow. Consequently no sign. It was the 25th of June. Should the sky stay overcast for 6 more days, the observation would have to be put off for another year. I will not attempt to describe Professor Leidenbrock's impotent rage. The day passed without a shadow coming down to the bottom of the crater. Hans didn't move from where he was, although he must have wondered what we were waiting for, if he wondered anything. My uncle didn't address a single word to me. His eyes, invariably turned to the sky, blended into the gray and misty background. 65 Pluto, the Greek god of the underworld. On the 26th, still nothing. Rain mixed with snow fell during the day. Hans built a hut with pieces of lava. I took some pleasure from watching the thousands of improvised cascades running down the sides of the cone, with each of its stones adding to the deafening murmur. My uncle could no longer hold himself back. The most patient man could legitimately be irritated, for this really was like sinking while coming into harbor. But heaven constantly mixes great joys with great sorrows, and it was preparing a satisfaction for Professor Leidenbrock equal to his terrible disappointments. The sky was still covered the following day. But on Sunday the 28th of June, the third last day of the month, the change of moon coincided with a change in the weather. The sun poured its abundant rays down into the crater. Each hummock, each rock, each boulder, each bump, had its share of the luminous flow and instantly cast its shadow on the ground. That of Skartaris, especially, stood out like a sharp stone and began to turn imperceptibly with the radiant orb. My uncle turned with it. At the middle of the day, when it was shortest, it came and gently kissed the edge of the middle chimney. "It is there. There it is," shouted the professor. "To the center of the globe," he added in Danish. I looked at Hans. "For it. 66, he said calmly. "Forward," replied my uncle. It was 13 minutes past 1:17 the real journey began. Until now things had been more tiring than difficult, but henceforth problems were literally going to spring forth under our feet. I had still not looked down at the fathomless pit into which I was going to engulf myself. The moment had arrived. I could still either take part in the venture or else refuse to try it. But I felt ashamed to turn back in the hunter's presence. Hans accepted the adventure so calmly, with such indifference, such unconcern at all danger, that I blushed at the idea of being less brave than him. On my own, I would have launched into a whole series of important arguments, but since the guide was there I remained silent. My memory flew back towards my pretty Verland girl, and I approached the middle chimney. As mentioned already, it was 100 feet across, or about 300 feet right round. I leant over an overhanging rock, and looked. My hair stood on end. An impression of void took hold of my being. I felt my center of gravity moving through me and dizziness going to my head like a heady brew. Nothing more intoxicating than this attraction of the abyss. I-66, for it, is Swedish for before, formerly, was going to fall. A hand held me back. Hans's. Decidedly, I hadn't had enough lessons in chasms at the Frelsers Kirk in Copenhagen. But however little I dared look down into the well, I had realized what shape it was. Its walls, almost perpendicular, had many projections which were certainly going to make them easier to climb down. But if there was an adequate staircase, there was no banister. A rope attached at the mouth would have provided sufficient support, but how to untie it when we got to its end? My uncle employed a very simple method to get round this difficulty. He unrolled a rope as thick as a thumb and 400 feet long. First he dropped half of it down, then wound it round a block of lava which projected outwards, and finally threw the other half into the chimney. Each of us could then climb down while holding together the two halves of the rope, which couldn't slip. 200 feet further on, nothing would be easier than bringing it down by letting one end go and pulling on the other. We would then be able to repeat this exercise ad infinitum. Now, said my uncle, having finished these preparations, let's think about the luggage. It will be split into 3, and each of us will strap a package to his back. I refer only to the fragile objects. The bold professor clearly didn't include us in the last category. Hans will carry the tools and a third of the food, you, Axel, another third of the food and the firearms, I will take the rest of it and the delicate instruments. But what about the clothing and this great pile of ropes and ladders, who will take charge of them? There is no need. Why? You will see. My uncle liked to employ strong-arm methods, without hesitating. On his command, Hans tied the non-fragile objects into a single packet, which was roped solidly together, and then quite simply dropped down into the abyss. I heard the lowing sound produced by the movements of the layers of air. My uncle, leaning over the gulf, watched the descent of our luggage with a satisfied air, and stood up again only after losing sight of it. Right. We are next. I ask any man of good faith if it was possible to listen to such words without getting cold shivers. The professor attached the package of instruments to his back, Hans took the implements, myself the firearms. The descent began in the following order: Hans, my uncle, myself. It proceeded in deep silence, broken only by rock debris falling into the abyss. I allowed myself to flow, so to speak, with one hand desperately holding on to the double rope, and the other using my alpenstock to slow me down. A single idea obsessed me: I was afraid of losing all means of support. This rope seemed to me very fragile for bearing the weight of 3 people. I used it as little as possible, performing miracles of balance on the lava projections that my foot tried to hold onto like a hand. When one of these precarious steps happened to dislodge under Hans's feet, he would say in his calm voice, "Gif akt. Careful," repeated my uncle. After half an hour we had reached the top of a boulder solidly attached to the wall of the chimney. Hans pulled one of the ends of the rope, and the other rose in the air. Having gone round the rock at the top, it fell back, dragging down pieces of rock and lava, a sort of rain or rather hail, full of danger. Leaning over our narrow platform, I noticed that the bottom of the hole could still not be seen. The rope maneuver began again, and half an hour later we had got 200 feet deeper. I don't know if, during such a descent, the most fanatical geologist would have tried to study the nature of the formations surrounding him. As for me, I hardly thought about them. I was not really bothered whether they were Pliocene, Miocene, Eocene, Cretaceous, Jurassic, Triassic, Permian, Carboniferous, Devonian, Silurian, or primitive. But the professor undoubtedly made observations or else took notes, for during one of our halts he said, "The further I go, the more confident I become. The arrangement of these volcanic formations absolutely confirms Davy's theory. We are in the middle of primordial ground, the ground where the chemical reaction occurred of the metals burning on contact with the air and water. I absolutely refuse to accept the theory of a heat in the center. In any case, we will see for ourselves. Still the same conclusion. It goes without saying that I didn't bother to discuss it. My silence was taken for agreement, and the descent began again. After 3 hours, I had still not caught a glimpse of the bottom of the chimney. When I looked up I could see the mouth, which was getting quite a lot smaller. Because of the small angle between the walls, they looked as though they were coming together. It was slowly getting darker and darker. We were still going down. It seemed to me that the rocks disturbed from the walls were swallowed up with a duller reverberation and that they ought to be reaching the bottom of the abyss more quickly. As I had carefully noted the operations of the rope, I was able to calculate the precise depth and time elapsed. We'd used the rope 14 times, taking half an hour each time. So we'd spent 7 hours plus 14 rest periods of 15 minutes, or 3.5 hours. 10.5 in total. Since we had left at 1, it had to be about 11 now. As for the depth reached, the 14 operations of the rope gave 2,800 feet. At that moment Hans's voice was heard, "Halt." I stopped dead at the moment my feet were about to collide with my uncle's head. "We are there," he said. "Where?" I asked, slipping down beside him. "At the bottom of the vertical chimney. And there's no way out." "Yes, there is. I can just see a sort of corridor at an angle towards the right. We will have a look tomorrow. Let's eat, and then we can sleep." It was still not completely dark. We opened the food bag, ate, and lay down, each doing his best to make a bed amongst the stone and lava debris. Lying on my back, I opened my eyes and caught sight of a brilliant object at the other end of the 3,000-foot-long tube, converted into a gigantic telescope. It was a star, but not twinkling at all. According to my calculations, it was beta of the little bear. Then I fell into a deep sleep. 18 at 8 in the morning, a ray of daylight came and woke us up. The thousand facets of the lava on the walls picked it up on the way down and scattered it everywhere like a shower of sparks. These gleams were enough for us to be able to distinguish the surrounding objects. Well, Axel, what do you say? Shouted my uncle, rubbing his hands together. Have you ever spent a more peaceful night in our house on Königstrasse? No noise of cartwheels, no cries from the market, no yelling boatmen. It is admittedly very calm at the bottom of this well, but such quiet has itself rather a frightening effect. Come now. If you are frightened already, what will you be like later? We have not gone a single inch into the bowels of the earth. What do you mean? I mean that we have only reached ground level on the island. This long vertical tube leading down from the crater of Snæfell stops at approximately sea level. Are you certain? Absolutely. Have a look at the barometer. The mercury, after rising in the instrument as we descended, had indeed stopped at 30 inches. You see, the pressure is still only 1 atmosphere, and I am looking forward to the manometer replacing the barometer. The barometer was indeed going to become useless when the weight of the air was greater than its pressure as calculated at sea level. But shouldn't we be afraid that the ever-increasing pressure will become highly uncomfortable? No, we will descend slowly, and our lungs will get used to breathing a denser atmosphere. Aeronauts eventually lack air when they climb up into the highest layers, although we ourselves may perhaps have too much. But I prefer that. Let's not waste a moment. Where is the package that came down the inside of the mountain before us? I remembered then that we had looked for it the evening before but not found it. My uncle questioned Hans, who looked carefully with his hunter's eyes, then replied, Der Hoop. Up there. The package was indeed hanging from a projecting rock 100 feet above our heads. The agile Icelander immediately climbed up like a cat and, a few moments later, it had caught up with us. Now, said my uncle, let's have breakfast, but a breakfast like people who perhaps have a long journey ahead of them. The dried meat and biscuit were washed down with a few mouthfuls of water mixed with gin. Once we had finished, my uncle pulled from his pocket a notebook designed for observations. He examined each of the various instruments in turn and wrote down the date, Monday the 1st of July 67 chronometer, 8:17 a.m. Barometer, 29/12 thermometer, 6 degrees Celsius direction, SA. The last observation referred to the dark corridor, as indicated by the compass. Now, Axel, cried the professor enthusiastically, we are going to penetrate the globe's bowels proper. This is the precise moment when our journey begins. Saying that, with one hand he took the Ruhmkorff lamp, which was hanging round his neck. With the other he applied the electric current to the filament of the lamp, and a brightish light chased the darkness from the tunnel. Hans carried the second lamp, which was also switched on. This ingenious application of electricity allowed us to go for a long time in artificial daylight, even through the most inflammable of gases. Let's get going, said my uncle. Each of us picked up his bundle. Hans took charge of pushing the packet of ropes and clothing in front of him, and with me in third position we entered the gallery. Just as I plunged into the black passage, I raised my head and looked through the long tube at the sky of Iceland, that I would never see again. 67 Monday the 1st of July, this should logically be Monday the 29th of June. During its last eruption in 1229, the lava had forced its way through the tunnel. It had carpeted the inside with a thick, shiny coating. The electric light was now reflected in it, becoming 100 times brighter. The only difficulty consisted of not sliding down the slope too quickly, for it was at an angle of about 45 degrees. Fortunately, worn-away parts and blisters acted as steps, and all we had to do was let our packages slide, held back by a long rope. But what acted as steps under our feet became stalactites on certain walls. The lava, porous in places, was covered with little round bulbs, crystals of opaque quartz, decorated with clear drops of glass, hung from the vaulted ceiling like chandeliers, and seemed to light up as we passed. It was as if the spirits of the underground were lighting up their palace to welcome their guests from the earth. It's magnificent, I shouted in spite of myself. What a sight, uncle. Look at the colors in the lava, which go from reddish-brown to bright yellow absolutely continuously. And these crystals that look like luminous globes. You're getting there, Axel. So you admire all that, my boy. You will see lots more, I hope. Come on, off we go. He should have said, off we slide, for we were able to simply let ourselves go on these inclined slopes, without straining ourselves. It was Virgil's Facilis Descensus Averni .68. The compass, which I often consulted, showed the direction as southeast with an unflinching precision. The lava flow deviated to neither side. It had the inflexibility of a straight line. Meanwhile it wasn't getting appreciably warmer. This confirmed Davy's theories, and several times I looked at the thermometer with surprise. 2 hours after we had left, it still only indicated 10 degrees, in other words an increase of 4 degrees. That made me think that our journey was more horizontal than vertical. As for knowing the exact depth reached, nothing was easier. The professor measured the precise vertical and horizontal angles of our route but kept the results to himself. At about 8 in the evening, he gave the signal to stop. Hans immediately sat down. The lamps were hung from convenient pieces of lava. We were in a sort of cabin where there was no lack of air. On the contrary, we felt a wind blowing. What was causing it? What movement in the atmosphere did it arise from? I wasn't really interested in answering the question at that moment. Hunger and tiredness made me unable to think. A descent of 7 hours without stopping produces a great depletion of energy. I was exhausted, and had been very glad to hear the word, halt. Hans spread out a few provisions on a block of lava and each of us ate hungrily. One thing worried me, though, half-hour supply of water had been used up. My uncle planned to replenish it at underwater springs, but there hadn't been a single one so far. I couldn't help mentioning it to him. Are you surprised by the absence of streams? He replied, 68 Facilis descensus Averni, an easy descent into the Avernus, Hades, the Aeneid, BK6. The Avernus was a lake in a crater near Naples, believed to be the source of the river Styx. Yes, and even worried. We have water left for only 5 days. Don't worry, Axel, my reply is that we will find water, and more than we want. When? When we have left the lava envelope. How do you think that springs can get through these walls? But the lava flow may continue to a great depth. And we don't seem to have gone very far yet in the vertical direction. What makes you say that? Because if we had gone a long way into the interior of the Earth's crust, the heat would be greater than it is. According to your system. What does the thermometer say? Hardly 15 degrees, which is only 9 degrees more than when we left. And your conclusion? I conclude as follows. From the most precise observations, we know that the temperature increases by 1 degree for every 100 feet you go into the interior of the globe. But local conditions can sometimes alter that figure. Thus in Yakutsk in Siberia, it has been observed that the increase is 1 degree for every 36 feet. The difference clearly depends on the conductivity of the rock. One can also add that in the neighborhood of an extinct volcano through the gneiss, the increase is only 1 degree for every 125 feet. Let us therefore take this last hypothesis, which is the most favorable, and let us calculate. Calculate on, my boy. It's child's play, I said, jotting the figures down in my notebook. 9 times 125 feet gives 1,125 feet deep. So it does. Well, according to my observations, we are now 10,000 feet below sea level. Are we really? Yes, or else figures are no longer figures. The professor's calculations were correct. We had gone 6,000 feet further than the greatest depths achieved by man, such as the mines of Kitzbühel in the Tyrol or those of Wittenberg in Bohemia. 69 The temperature, which should have been 81 degrees at this spot, was barely 15 degrees. It made you think. 19 At 6 a.m. the following day, Tuesday the 30th of June, the journey began again. We were still following the lava gallery, truly a natural ramp, as gentle as those inclined planes that still replace staircases in old houses. This 69 Wittenberg in Bohemia, Michel Verne describes the mines of Kitzbühel, Tyrol, and of Wittenberg, Bohemia, as being 1,400 meters deep. Zigzags B. Travers La Science, Sus Terra, Figaro, the 18th of August. 1888, continued until 12.17, the precise moment when we caught up with Hans, who had just stopped. Ah, exclaimed my uncle, we have reached the end of the chimney. I looked around. We were in the middle of an intersection, with 2 paths heading forward, both of them dark and narrow. Which one were we to take? We had a problem. But my uncle didn't want to appear to hesitate before either me or the guide. He pointed to the eastern tunnel, and soon all 3 of us had plunged into it. In any case, any deliberation about the choice of path could have gone on indefinitely, for no clue could possibly determine the choice of one or the other. We had to trust entirely to chance. The slope of the new gallery was very gentle, and the cross-section varied a great deal. Sometimes a succession of arches unfolded before us like the counter-naves of a Gothic cathedral. The artists of the Middle Ages could easily have studied here all the forms of religious architecture generated by the ogive. A mile further on, we had to bow our heads under low semicircular arches in the Roman style, with thick pillars forming part of the rock itself, bending under the spring of the vaults. At certain places, these forms gave way to low substructures that looked like beavers' work, and we crawled and slid through narrow intestines. The heat stayed at a tolerable level. I couldn't help thinking about its intensity when the lalas vomited by Snæfell's had rushed through this path today so peaceful. I imagined the rivers of fire broken at the angles in the tunnel and the buildup of superheated steam in this enclosed space. Provided, I thought that the old volcano doesn't decide to give in again to a senile fantasy. I didn't mention these ideas to Uncle Leidenbrock, he wouldn't have understood. His sole thought was to go forward. He walked, he slid, he tumbled down even, with a degree of conviction that it was better after all to admire. At 6 p.m., following a relatively easy march, we had covered 5 miles in a southerly direction, but scarcely a quarter of a mile in depth. My uncle gave the signal to stop. We ate without talking very much, and then went to sleep without thinking very much. Our arrangements for the night were very simple. Traveling rugs, which we rolled ourselves up in, were our sole bedding. We had no fear of cold, nor of surprise visits. Those travelers who penetrate the middle of the deserts of Africa or the heart of the forests of the New World are forced to watch over each other during the hours of sleep. But here, absolute solitude and complete safety. Savages are wild beasts, none of these harmful races were to be feared. In the morning we woke fresh and revitalized. We started off again. We were following a lava route like the day before. Impossible to recognize what sort of formations we were passing through. Instead of going down into the bowels of the globe, the tunnel was becoming more and more horizontal. I even thought it was heading back up towards the surface of the earth. At about 10 a.m., the tendency became so clear, and consequently so tiring, that I had to slow our progress. Well, Axel, the professor said impatiently. Well, I'm totally exhausted. What, after 3 hours of strolling along such an easy route? Easy, perhaps, but most certainly tiring. But all we have to do is descend. Climb, with respect. Climb, said my uncle, shrugging his shoulders. Definitely. For the last half hour, the gradient's been different, and were we to follow it to the end, we'd certainly get back to the soil of Iceland.